All right, welcome back to week 6 of our Journeys of Paul Bible study. So, like I've done in the weeks past, I'm going to kind of give you some orienting ideas about the letter, and then I will send you on your way to discuss in the Sunday school class. And if you read ahead, you know that there's a lot that we could cover in this particular letter. It's one of Paul's most sophisticated ones. It stands right next to Romans. It's doing something a little bit different. Um, but we get all sorts of things. For instance, we get the earliest account of the Lord's Supper. We get the beautiful poem about love that you hear at weddings. We get Paul's announcement about the resurrection. All of this stuff jam-packed in this letter of more chapters than most of the other letters we have in the New Testament. So I just want to kind of remind us that we're dealing with vast geographical area in a time before there were trains, planes, and automobiles. So here we were a few weeks ago in Thessalonica. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians from Corinth. So he goes to Corinth and he's writing back to the Thessalonians. And you'll see we kind of zoom back out, and then I'm going to show you that's where we're going. So that's the journey to Corinth. So we're staying in that kind of area in Greece. Um, and he's going to leave Corinth and he's going to go over to Ephesus. And from Ephesus is where he's going to write the letter. Now, at this point, I think it's very helpful to think about our move from Galatians, which we talked about 2 weeks ago, to First Corinthians. If you remember, when we talked about Galatians, Paul was dealing with the kind of a teaching of the people of James coming in and saying that the Gentiles had to be circumcised. So if you think about Galatians as addressing kind of a particularly Jewish overemphasis, like now Gentiles must become Jewish. So that's the emphasis. Jesus came and he opened up the way for Gentiles to enter into the Jewish faith. That is one overemphasis that Paul has to address. And if you remember at the very beginning of the Bible study, I talked about how Paul was constantly kind of navigating and rewriting the rules in several different spheres. So you have the sphere of his Jewish background. So this Galatians was him addressing that sphere. You guys are overemphasizing circumcision and the rules of the law and holy days. In First Corinthians, we go to the other side, where now he's addressing the Greek sphere. And this is why this letter is so hung up on proper worship and proper sexual ethics, is because those are areas that the Gentiles, particularly the Greek and Roman Gentiles, really needed work on. So that's a helpful way of thinking about the transition we're making. We're going from Paul addressing a group that has a lot of Jewish Christians in it to now a group that's made up primarily of Gentile Christians. And so he's got to balance different emphases. So in Acts, we get, as we did with Thessalonica, we get a description of what Paul did when he gets to Corinth. Every Sabbath, he interacted with people in the synagogue, trying to convince both Jews and Greeks. So remember, they were oftentimes curious Greeks who were sympathetic to the Jewish faith, and so they would be at the synagogue. So again, we have his standard practice, but here we're about to see it change. Once Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself fully to the word, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ and that would be the Messiah. When they opposed and slandered him, he shook the dust from his clothes in protest and said to them, "You are responsible for your own fates. I'm innocent. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles." He left the synagogue and went next door to the home of Titius Justus, a Gentile God worshipper. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household came to believe in the Lord. Many Corinthians believed and were baptized after listening to Paul. He stayed there for 18 months. So he was there for a considerable amount of time, about the amount of time I've been with you all. So think about him being in place for that long. And talking and teaching, and he's got a group of Jews and Gentiles forming this church, but it's now outside of the synagogue. And so some other kind of historical context that would be helpful for you to kind of have in your mind as you're grappling with this letter. We have a wide variety of social social backgrounds here. So not just do we have a group of, now it seems like by the time we get the letter, mostly Gentiles because of the what he's having to say. We have that mix of Jews and Gentiles, but we also have some that are not very educated. You've got some from a high social class, And then you also have some who are slaves. You have some who are free. So the church in Corinth covers the whole spectrum of society at the time, and you get a lot of Paul talking about how women should behave. So you know that there are a lot of women in the church with and taking up positions of power, of prayer, of taking their roles of leadership in the church. While also this is the letter where he says he doesn't let women talk in church. Also the same letter where he tells you when they talk, here's what they should wear. So you can discuss that in Sunday school if you like to. So he was there sometime around 51 of the Common Era and wrote the letter about 3 to 4 years later. And again, he's writing from Ephesus. And just remember that he's active from kind of 33 of the Common Era to 57. So he's writing this relatively late in his ministry. This is kind of right in the middle of his letter writing period. So he's writing to address conflict and divisions that are in the church, and you see that right off at the beginning of the letter. So here's your outline. So the letter begins, he greets them again, he praises them for good things, and then he gets right into the fact that he hears about them, they're having divisions, and so he names that there's the cross and the Holy Spirit. He wants that front and center. The cross has broken down the wall between Jew and Gentile, he says later on in Ephesians. And here he's kind of living into that, trying to help them see how the cross creates unity and the Spirit brings that unity amongst them, which leads him straight into talking about sexual ethics. And as I said a few weeks ago, it's hard for us to imagine that that in the Greco-Roman world, they just were as open about having sex with as many people as they wanted to as they could be. And again, not the women, because there was no such thing as birth control, but the men, like the moment a Greco-Roman father saw that his son entered puberty and they were of the right social class, he would throw him an orgy, like with prostitutes and everything. So that was the world. And Paul is having to say to them, you need to be a little bit more like the Jews in this and not like the Gentile pagan world. So this is why he has to move into the cross has kind of brought a new world into being, is letting them in, but they do have to act in appropriate ways. That leads him into talking about marriage and divorce. He has to talk about food and idolatry because, of course, most of the food that they would have been eating would have been food sacrificed to idols. And what do you do about that if that's your normal way of eating? And now you've been brought into something that is the Jewish faith, but the rules don't always apply. So he then goes straight into this. And you will remember our discussion about Acts. Like one of the things that Acts letter said was they weren't to eat food sacrificed to idols. And here Paul is saying something a little bit different. And then he talks about orderly worship because, again, he's having to explain to Gentile Christians what worship looks like. Now, because Christian worship looks like what worship in the synagogue would look like, he didn't have to explain that in Galatians in the way he does here in 1 Corinthians. So again, we're seeing him kind of try to instruct this group of mainly Gentile Christians what they're supposed to do. He reminds them of the Last Supper, and he's constantly emphasizing unity. Which brings him to spiritual gifts and love, and he continues talking about worship and how worship is about unity. And in that kind of context is where you get that great poem about love. And then he emphasizes the resurrection because, again, he's trying to help them see that if Jesus was raised from the dead, that impacts their ethics. It impacts the way that they're supposed to act with one another, the way they're supposed to act with the world at large. And so he gives us that beautiful passage in 1 Corinthians 15 where he talks about what it means that Christ was actually raised from the dead. And this is all going to be very firmly in your brains because we just read that last week. And then he closes the letter and he lets them begin to see here in the closing that that this unity that they have with one another actually connects them to the larger church. And this is where he starts to ask for money for a collection that he's going to take over to the church in Jerusalem, which doesn't have that needs support. And so he's saying, and he says this later on in 2 Corinthians, they're wealthy in terms of money, and the Jerusalem church is wealthy in terms of the fact that that's where the faith began. And so it's up to them to kind of support that church. And that'll become a major source of conflict as we move into 2 Corinthians in a couple of weeks. But that's how he closes out the letter. And again, it's all of this is emphasizing that what happened in Christ changed the world, united Jews and Greeks together, creates a new ethics for the Greco-Roman Christians, creates a new ethics for the Jewish Christians too, in terms of their ritual practices. Unites those people, but then also unites them to one another. So we start to see that Paul conceives of the church is spread out throughout this whole geographical region, where he has to get on a boat and travel for weeks and weeks and months to get from one church to the next church, and yet still he thinks that they are united together. So if I were to take a stab at summarizing this letter, my stab would look something like this. Hey, Gentiles, the resurrection means you are united to your Jewish brethren. And while you might not have to become Jewish, you still have to act right. And so that's what Paul is trying to do. He talks about it in terms of their sexual ethics. He talks about it in terms of their worship. He talks about it in terms of giving money to help their Jewish Christian siblings over in Jerusalem. So the resurrection has united them to their Jewish brothers and sisters. And while they don't have to get circumcised, they still do have to take on many of the Jewish rules about sexual ethics and about how you behave, particularly when it comes to idolatry and the worship of false gods. So that's what's happening there. Paul really is talking about how the cross and the resurrection have completely changed the world, and he's trying to help these Gentiles understand how they now need to act. So for your discussion this week, I thought it might be good to think about these kind of three important places within the letter, and I'll put the actual verses on that sheet of paper that I'll put on the table for you. But in this, this is where we get the earliest teaching about the Eucharist. So I thought it'd be fun for you all to go look at that and like, what do you see? What does it make you think about? Why do you think that's in this letter? And then he talks about love in that beautiful poem. How is that connected to the Eucharist? And then finally, he unpacks the reality of the resurrection. How do all those things fit together? Clearly, they do in Paul's mind. I want you all to discuss like, how does it all work together? Because this is the kind of thing we do every week. We come and gather because of the resurrection. We pass the peace and tell one another we love each other, and then we celebrate communion together. And we find that already in one of these early letters from Paul that pre-exist the writing of the Gospels. I think that would be a fun conversation to have over the next 40 or 50 minutes. And I look forward to being with you all in a couple of weeks. You can look forward to the next video next Sunday. And I think we're reading Philippians and 2 Corinthians, but don't quote me on that. I don't have my sheet in front of me. So, all right, I'll talk to you all soon.